Back to this random live of beginning of the week. And here is the topic that I wanted to share with you from my own experience as well, the topic of I am exhausted and what to do about it. And this is a topic that I keep hearing from so many of my clients, and one of the things that I want to share with you is the observations that I'm making as I coach more and more humanitarian clients is the observation that whenever we are thinking, I'm exhausted, we tend to often not to really look at the cause of why we're exhausted. We tend to more reacting to it. We keep believing that nothing much can be done about it, or even if we feel like we know what to do about it, but we feel exhausted, so therefore we don't really do anything about it, and therefore keep making this thing like a very exhaustion ocean that we can't do anything, but rather keep um, either not wanting to do anything afterwards, right? So, for instance, a lot of my clients tell me that they come home and they feel exhausted. They don't want to do anything else. They feel like they don't have energy for anything else. And they barely make their food. They order something and then they just eat. And then maybe they scrape some time to work on something because it's urgent. But other than that, then they crash, they go to bed. And then the next morning it continues and they like force themselves out of bed, and then they continue with the day, forcing through the whole day, and then arriving until the evening, and then the cycle continues, right? And even if they want to do something else, they want to socialize, for instance, but then they barely do it because they feel like they have to do something else, but they barely do it, and then they go through that event, and then they come back feeling exhausted. So if this is familiar to you, it is also very familiar to me. And at some point in the last years of my humanitarian career, this is actually what I have done. I have actually decided to study it, to decide to do something about it, because my whole rhetoric or my whole narrative, my story around my work a lot of the time has been I'm exhausted. I have no energy for this. I cannot look at anything else but this work, right? I was just like in this state of mind all of the time, and this is how I have handled it. And also, I have been coaching my clients around not only reacting or to keep reacting to this, which is understandable that we want to react, we want to do something about it, but also understanding why this is happening is key, right? Because when we are putting ourselves in this exhausted mode, right, the way that you can think about it, like think of your phone, you put it in the energy saving mode. For me, it's like the way that I'm exhausted sounds like that as well. Is like we're putting ourselves in this mode of I'm exhausted, and therefore our brain keeps saving energy and wanting to protect us. And by doing that, we just exclude everything else except the the minimum or the basics or the fundamental, whatever the thing that we choose to be in that moment, the most important, we just keep focusing on that, but and excluding everything else. But many of my clients come to me wanting to actually finally prioritize other things beside work as well. And if we want to do that, then we need to get ourselves out of that exhausted mode into at least the curiosity mode to find out what's really going on. And oftentimes I think we believe that we know the answer, and then we believe also because we know the answer, nothing can be done about it. And therefore, we just assume a lot of the things and therefore decide not to do anything about it. But the problem is that as long as we keep the status quo of I am exhausted and nothing can be done about it, then we will bring ourselves to a point where it becomes so difficult, or it becomes burnout or depression, which I have gone through myself, and then it becomes even more difficult to get out of it. And that's why I really want people to think about not only like what to do about it, but also take the time to actually solve those things that keep creating for us the this outcome of exhaustion. Now, when I have studied this myself in my own experience of how I kept telling myself that I'm exhausted, at some point I felt like it was so I was so depressed and burnout at some point. I was in hospital. I think I've told you this story many times, but the part that I really want to focus here is that when I had this feeling of I can't do anything anymore, or like I can't go on this way anymore, right? This feeling of, okay, this is enough. And that point when I started looking at is I was looking at three things, using my knowledge of studying coaching and looking at my thoughts. I was looking at three things. One is the exhaustion the physical thing, right? The physical symptoms. Is this the emotional thing? Or it's just a habitual thing that I just am so used to telling myself. And I decided to test all of them at that time when I had time, but also I was determined to do that even during working hours, during working times, to really getting to know myself from these three standpoints, right? Is this the physical thing? Is this the physical manifestation of my exhaustion? Is this the emotional one, or is this the habitual one? And then I was also asking myself, how would I know which one is which? So if you really want to do something about it, get curious as to which part is it, or it's a combination of three, right? I suspect that for many of us, it's a combination of three, but it's for you to get curious as to finding out what is it, which one is it. And the reason why it's important that you understand which one is it for you, then you start addressing three of them in three different ways. And I will explain to you how I have done it in my own experience. And I suggest for you to get curious as to how you could do it as well. So then what I did was I thought first that it might be the physical manifestation. I am physically tired of certain things, right? And at that time, it was like overworking, stress, and all of these things. And I was thinking, okay, it might be the physical, like tiredness. And then I started observing myself how that physical exhaustion looked like. What I noticed was for myself is that when I'm physically exhausted, my body automatically shut down at some point. Like I wouldn't even last until the evening so much. I would just fall asleep somewhere, even not much realizing if I'm falling asleep or not. So I realized that the physical exhaustion was either I am like shut down, or the other one is I have difficulty sleeping, right? I have difficulty sleeping. And that's when I started realizing that it's not so much the physical one, it's more like the emotional one of exhaustion that I was at the time suffering from. And the emotional exhaustion was the second thing that I started getting curious about. So first I was like telling myself, okay, if it's a physical exhaustion, then I want to sleep. I want to give my body a lot of time to sleep. I would sleep some of the weekends until 2 p.m. in the afternoon. I would sleep through all the time. And I would just allow myself to do all of these things so that I can exclude the physical exhaustion, right? And then I started realizing that the emotional exhaustion was the other one. And then I started looking at what were the reasons why I'm emotionally exhausted. And then quickly I started realizing one was the big feeling of not feeling like in charge. I was always reacting to things like emergency thing after emergency thing, and I was working in the emergency setting at the time. So I one of the big reasons I found for myself was that I was just reacting to everything. Like the messages keep coming in, I kept looking at the messages. the solving things urgently or reacting to colleagues' issues, whatever it is, keep reacting to a point that I just kept feeling exhausted every evening. Right? So compiling that without processing that. The other exhaustion, that big theme within that emotional exhaustion that I had, was that feeling like a victim all of the time, feeling powerless all of the time. And that made me exhausted the whole time. Right? So I can't do this. It doesn't depend on me. This is unfair. Whatever the things are that kept making me feel powerless and powerless, and then not really processing any of those emotions. And I felt like my body couldn't take in any more emotions anymore. It's a bit like, when you have the feeling of everything is spilling out of you because you can't contain anything anymore. This was the feeling for me. And then the third element of that emotional exhaustion that I had back in the day was keep feeling worry or resistance, or like some part of this is not how it should be, or worry of things could go worse, worry of other people's opinions, worry of some sort, right? So these were the three, I think, the biggest parts for me that made me feel exhausted all of the time. And I didn't really have the tools to learn, like, to process my emotions back in the day. So that's why it felt like emotions kept being created, and I couldn't do anything about them. And then my brain is like, okay, we're exhausted, we're shutting down. And that was the feeling. And then I started getting curious as to, okay, if this is what's happening, what am I going to do about them? Each of them, right? So this is what I started looking at and deciding what to do with them, and then start experimenting them. And the third one that I then got used to, or got curious about, is the part about being a habitual thing. And I was like so amazed when I found out that this was a habitual thing that I kept telling myself at some point, is because every Saturday morning I would just tell myself, oh, I'm exhausted. I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything. And one day I actually remember sitting in my apartment. Um, I think it was in Ukraine, I think. In the beginning stages of Ukraine mission, I remember just sitting in my apartment and thinking, okay, let me feel what that feels like to be exhausted. Let me just sit and feel what it feels like to be exhausted. And then I got curious as to what it feels to be tired and what's the difference between the two. And the thing that I found out for myself at the time that was so fascinating is that the tiredness felt like I knew why I was tired. Like there was some kind of explanation as to why that was happening. Whereas exhaustion felt like it was so like vast and vague and like, kind of this feeling of like, I don't even know where to start kind of feeling. And then I was thinking, but it's so strange because if I'm exhausted and I keep telling myself I'm exhausted every day, like this was my story every day, in the morning, in the evening, throughout the day, just keep saying I'm exhausted. And then once I started like looking at, okay, how does it feel? Why exactly am I exhausted? What is exhausting me? Like, let me just be curious and honest with myself to look at what is it exactly that's exhausting me. Because at the time I had amazing team, I had amazing life. I was working on a lot of amazing projects together with my team. It was my dream job. Everything was great. And I was just like, kept telling myself I'm exhausted. And that's when I realized that I was actually habitually keep training myself to think that I'm exhausted. Because I did another experiment back in the day about not complaining. I was listening to Tony Robinson at some point. Robinson or Robbins? Anyway, you know who I'm talking about. And I was listening to him, and he was saying that, well, why don't you do a fasting of non-complaint, like whatever it is that you're struggling, do a fasting of not saying that to yourself and not doing that thing for a week. I think he suggested a month, but I think I did it for a week, of non-complaint, not complaining for a week. And I was just recording when my brain wants to complain. And that's when I realized it was so hard not to complain, not because I couldn't, because my brain was so habitually addicted to keep saying it. It was like a bit of a me addicted to tea, right? At certain point, I just feel like I need to do this, even though maybe I have no reason to drink tea as such, but I my like habitual brain uh, with hormones together, right? Wanting me to make the tea. That's the same way it was with complaining. I realized that if I see someone that I used to complain to all the time, as soon as I would see, the first thing I would start is complaining. And when I told myself that I will no longer do, and I'm in a fasting period, it was so difficult not to do that. And the same I realized about exhaustion. Exhaustion is that I just kept training my brain, or like habitually telling my brain that I'm exhausted without realizing what is the reason why I was exhausted. Because I wasn't really particularly doing more job than anyone else was doing. I was coming home on time. I wasn't working outside of working hours most of the time. Maybe I was thinking one or two things outside of working hours, just one does, right? But there wasn't anything that was exhausting me. And that's when I realized it was a habitual thing. So that's why, my dears, check with yourself. What is it like, besides feeling and processing your emotions around exhaustion? Like, the first thing I suggest for you to do is, if you notice, okay, you want to do something about your I'm exhausted state, if you want to do something about it, like, first, I would suggest for you to just get curious and sit with that feeling of exhaustion. How does that feel? Like, just keep listening to it without doing anything else, but just feeling, how does that feel? Where does it feel in your body? And start feeling whatever it is that you want to feel. And then get curious, which one of these three could be your exhaustion? Is this the physical, emotional, or habitual, right? Physical, I would also put the parts where we feel fear from being in war zones or being in dangerous zones. I think fear could also exhaust us very fast, and that's something that is a physical manifestation. And that, I think, a lot of the times happens on the unconscious level. So that's why, if it's a physical, then also thinking about how can you give more time to yourself, to your body, to rest and recuperate, right? So that would be on the physical side. And then you can get curious as to the emotional part, as to what are the feelings that keep coming up oftentimes that is then closely associated to exhausted. For instance, it could be disappointment is very closely associated to exhausted, or frustrated, or worried, whatever it is. Then start getting curious as to what is causing it and what are you going to do about it. Excuse me. And then the third one is, if you feel like it's habitual, so you can like experiment with yourself and say, what if you didn't say you're exhausted for 1 week? Not only you didn't say, but you didn't think about it. How would be different? What would be different? Excuse me. Right? So you can get curious with yourself as to where it's coming from, what exactly it is causing you to feel exhausted, and what are you going to do about it in terms of the sources of exhaustion, rather than keep just reacting to the outcome and the consequences of it. And if you want coaching on this, please let me know. I would love to coach you, because having gone through all of this myself and having like experimented and get curious and learned all of this myself, I would love to help you also hear or develop your own techniques of how you can get curious and study yourself in the way that is most useful to you to get to feeling not exhausted, at least not all the time. Okay, my dears. Have a beautiful week, and I will speak to you very soon.